I just wondered if we might start the conversation by talking about magic in general. And David, I'll come to you and just ask, what do you understand magic to mean?
Oh, magic. So for me, magic is the experience of being alive inside a world that is itself alive. So the clear awareness that anything you experience, whether it be a storm cloud or a forest or a spider crawling up a blade of grass or the blade of grass itself, each of these, the awareness that each thing you experience is an experiencing form itself, tasting the world through its own senses, encountering actually the very same outrageous world that you encounter, yet from an astonishingly different angle and perspective. So I would say that, yeah, that's the heart of magic. So there's nothing in my sense of it, there's nothing supernatural about magic whatsoever. It is actually nature itself. It is the way nature displays itself, shows itself to any creature or entity within it who is fully embodied and with its senses awake, situated in the midst of the earthly biosphere or in the midst of nature. Nature looks like a set of objects and objective mechanical processes when we look upon it from outside, as it were, from a kind of disembodied or God's eye gaze. But when we're fully embodied in its depths, nature discloses itself to us as magic through and through.
Wow, thank you. Can I ask the same to you, Sharon?
Yeah, I guess I absolutely go along with that. But I think from our native traditions in the British Isles and in Ireland, where my ancestry is from, I think a lot of those traditions tell us that really magic is a kind of act of co-creation between us and the world. So it's an act of kind of transformation. But whereas often people, you know, when they read books or watch films today, they think that magic is something that somebody, a magician or whatever, does to the world. Actually, magic to me is a conversation between us and the world, which results in transformation, if that makes sense. So I like to use the word enchantment, not in any kind of airy-fairy sense, but enchantment in the original sense of the word, which the Latin encantare means to sing into. And to sing into is an act of power. It's an act of conversation. It's an act of relationship with the world. And in the native traditions of these islands, along with many other traditions around the world, you know, words did have power. So the right words spoken at the right place, in the right place rather, at the right time, and sometimes while adopting a particular physical stance, could literally change the world. But you didn't do that to the world. You kind of unveiled the world into your space and you invited it into a kind of transformative conversation. So I absolutely agree with David that to me, magic, enchantment, whatever you want to call it, is an act of relationship, of conversation between us and the world.
Beautiful. I'm really interested in you saying words, and that will, obviously we're here to talk about words, so we'll go into that in a moment. But where do these words come from? Do they come from nature, or do they come from our ancestry? Where do these words of power that have been used come from originally?
Well, also just listening to what Sharon so eloquently said, it put me in mind, as she's speaking of enchantment, of, and I hadn't thought of this to this moment, but let me see if I can remember it. The words spoken by an old Inuit magician, an elder named Nalungiak, when she was talking to Knud Rasmussen, great Scandinavian explorer early in the last century. And one of the things she said to him, if I can remember it, was in the very earliest time, when both people and animals lived on Earth, a person could become an animal if she wanted to, and an animal could become a human being. Sometimes they were people and sometimes animals, and there was no difference. All spoke the same language. See, that was the time when words were like magic. A word spoken by chance might have strange consequences. It would suddenly come alive, and what people wanted to happen could happen. All you had to do was say it. Nobody can explain this. That's just the way it was. That's
Wonderful. And I always think of having spent a lot of time because of my ancestry in you know, the Irish speaking and the Scottish Gaelic speaking. So the words that we use in the languages of the land, you know, that the languages of our indigenous people, even in these islands, we tend to forget that we have indigenous languages, are kind of reflect the way that we experience the land. So I don't just mean in a meaning sense, but literally the sounds often, you know, reflect back the sound that people think that the wind makes, or that the, you know, the rain makes on the bog or whatever. And so I think, picking up from what David said, I think a lot of the languages that we learned at the beginning when we were still in relationship with the land kind of arose out of the land. And again, it was to me, from a non-technical perspective, because I'm not a linguist, but the way that I imagine it is that also the words that we use, the sounds that we use to create language, are a kind of act of co-creation between us and the land. And when I say co-creation, I don't mean any kind of flaky way. I mean literally, you know, it's our imagination kind of tapping into the world's imagination, and something amazing happens when we allow that to happen.
Wow. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. In a sense, it does seem to me that all of our languages, the languages we currently speak, English or French or Inuktitut, but all of our spoken languages originated in a deeply oral context, which is to say in a deeply animistic context, when we were living as foragers, hunters, gatherers, assuming that everything, not just that everything was alive, but that everything speaks. And so our own human languages are born, I think this echoes very precisely what you were saying, Sharon, are born as a kind of call and response to a speaking world. And that even words, as you're saying, are born of that encounter. They're not born just within the human or among humans speaking just among themselves and deciding arbitrarily to, you know, let's call that an oak tree, but rather the trees, the other critters, the mountains, the rivers are speaking to us their own strange languages and telling us, teaching us how they are to be invoked. So a small example might be the words that we use to speak of the water moving through the banks of a stream. We'll use words like gush or rush, wash, splash. But the sound that unites all those words, gush, wash, splash, rush, is the sound that the water itself speaks as it moves between the banks. So clearly, our language is fed steadily by the speech of the more than human earth.
Yeah, and so when you enter into conversation with a stream or a tree or whatever, and you kind of speak back to it, you're kind of literally speaking its language.
Yes. Yes.
You talk about the power to transform then. How do we use language as humans? How do we use the language of embodiment then within nature to transform?
I think, again, one of the examples that I like to think of in this sense is that, again, if you look back to our native traditions and you look back to herbalism as it was once practiced in these islands, everywhere from Ireland through to very clearly the Anglo-Saxon tradition as well, a plant wouldn't heal unless words were spoken at the same time. You couldn't just give nettle, that would be silly. You gave nettle and then you spoke a charm, and the charm was often in praise of the plant. So it was kind of coaxing the plant into that act of transformation by telling it how wonderful it was, how much you appreciated its healing powers and what have you. And really that act of imagination combined with, you know, the reality of the pharmaceutical ingredients of that plant was what created the transformation. So the transformation is exactly, I think, what we've both been saying, that act of relationship where you respect the otherness and the intentionality of whatever it is you're working with, whether it be a plant for healing or a tree that you happen to want to have a conversation with, and then you draw it into relationship with you. You use words to tell it how fine it is, and the combination of the herb, the physical properties of the herb, and the ritual incantation, we come back again to incantare, enchantment, that was spoken at the same time, was what created the change, because you would capture the imagination of the person in the language as well as bringing the plant in, if that makes sense.
So what I hear in what Sharon is saying is something about the importance of praise, that being able to use one's words and phrases to honor, to praise, to bless, all very different uses of language from what we commonly today think of as the most basic form of language, that words are representations of the world. And so when we speak, we are sort of constructing a picture of the world, this very representational use of language. But it sounds very much from what Sharon is saying that originally or aboriginally or in our more oral, non-writing context, that words were, long before they became representations, or in a sense that even perhaps begins once you start writing words down, that you can begin to look at them as labels for things. And so then apple tree, the word apple becomes a label for that fruit or for that tree. But prior to writing it down, that words were used first and foremost to call, not to represent the tree, but to call to the tree, to invoke the tree, to call it forth, to respond to what the tree is speaking to me, even as the wind is bustling through its leaves and branches, to respond to its song with a song of my own, so that this most aboriginal use of words or language is to bridge the gap between oneself and the other, whether that other be a human being or a plant or an animal or a mountain. So in some way, I think it's linked to what we today call prayer. But one might say that prayer in its most basic sense is simply speaking to the world rather than speaking about the world. Using one's words not to talk about things, about the weather, about what's happening today, but to speak to the wind, to those clouds, or to call the rain forth, to coax it out. So it's a form of of bridging the gap. Yeah, it's a form of relationship, of coaxing, of praising, speaking to rather than about.
There's something that a lot of people are flagging up here on the chat about intention as well, because it feels as though the intention is involved in here. And you said the word imagination, Sharon. You know, these two I words seem to be very important somewhere in this liminal space between us and other. Yeah, I don't know whether that adds anything here.
I'm a little bit cautious always about use of the word intention. I mean, it can mean lots of things for clarity, and I always like to clarify what I mean, because intention can come across as a kind of power over thing. You know, my intention is that I'm going to make that happen in the world, and that's not to me how it works. But if you're talking about intention as a focus of energy, as a focus of your communication, as a focus of what you actually want to happen, then certainly, again, in our native traditions, intention was a huge part of that. And that act of choosing the right words, and we often, unfortunately, we don't know anymore what those right words would have been. You know, nobody wrote those down. That was part of the oral tradition. The Christian monks who inscribed all of our old stories weren't going to write that kind of stuff down. But the right words and in the right stance, you know, so we have this wonderful old stance in the Irish tradition, which is called the cranioch, the crane stance, where people would stand, where a druid, a bard, one of the filly would stand on one leg with one arm behind their back, and you have this kind of half person, this asymmetry, which is a function of shamanic traditions in many different countries. That was a powerful stance that was recognized by the other world. You know, that gave power to your intention, but your intention had to be very pure, and you had not to force it. Your intention was also an act of relationship. And so I think we have to be careful not to use intention as power over. And I suppose that's the only thing that I would kind of clarify in my understanding of how that works.
Mm. And when you speak of the stance, it suggests to me that it's also then a way of speaking, this incantational or magical use of words and phrases is something spoken by one's whole body. It's not, as we so often think today, that when we're in words, we're being very cognitive, we're being very mental, we're speaking out of our head in some manner. But to speak in a way that privileges also the stance, the particular pose or poise that I'm holding, is to say that I'm speaking as a full-bodied creature. I'm speaking with my whole animal body, not just with some fancy part of my head or cortex.
Exactly, and as you've written about it at beautiful length, that idea of the oral tradition as a very embodied language was absolutely, I think, part of our native traditions here. Yeah.
But wouldn't that also suggest then that the words that we spoke, and I think that we speak today whenever we step into that more incantatory mode, or when we are working with word magic in any sense, the words we use, we're not just speaking words that have particular meanings, but rather words wherein the meaning lives right there in the taste of the word, the rhythm of a phrase, the texture on my tongue of certain phrases. That is to say, to speak as a full-bodied animal is to be never leaving attention to the sound spell of words.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think what's interesting about, again, sorry, I always come back to it because that's what I know best, I suppose. And that's what I think is relevant to us in these islands at this time. Again, our own traditions are very much, you know, nobody went into darkened rooms and did this stuff. They did it out on the land. They did it next to a river. They did it next to a tree. They did it out there. They were part of it. They didn't see themselves as separate. So it wasn't like, you know, we'll go into a building in order to do sacred stuff. As you know, it's like any indigenous peoples around the world. It was out there in the land. And that was for a reason. It wasn't that they couldn't build buildings and structures. It's just that they thought that was silly. You know, if you wanted to create change in the world, if you wanted to create transformation, you did it with the world's participation.
Yes.
I was interested, Sharon, in something you said about these words they knew, but we don't know anymore because they weren't written down. I'm interested to know, you know, are these words of power rediscoverable? Do they belong to us as individuals? Can we go out into nature and find our own words? How do words of power evolve?
Yeah, I'm a great believer in finding our own way. You know, with the wisdom that we can glean from how our ancestors did it, or how indigenous peoples around the world do it now. But I think it's really important not to hark back and say, okay, it was lost 2,000 years ago, therefore we can't do it that anymore. How did they do it in the first place? They did it through listening, you know, and they did it, I think, through a very careful quality of attention. And I know it probably sounds a little bit strange, but whenever I talk about that, the thing that I always think of is Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea trilogy, you know, The Wizard of Earthsea, which I just loved as a child. And, you know, the whole business of the power of names. The reason in her world why a name had power, and if you knew somebody's name, you had power over them, is that that name was definitive of who you are. And you had to know that. You didn't just like learn a name, and you know, you had to somehow understand the nature of the person, and it was the understanding of the nature of the person embedded in the name that gave you the power over them in that particular case. And so to me, a lot of these, what we think of as words of power, if we want to use that word, it's not a word I'm particularly fond of, in terms of making change and conveying intention and the language that is tied up with the imagination, the language that works. It's about really understanding the essence of something. And that to me is all a word of power is. You don't just make words up, or that sounds pretty or whatever. You look at the tree and you sit with the tree, and you sit with the tree again, and you sit with it all year round in all kinds of weather, whether it's comfortable or not. And then eventually you learn the name of a tree, and that's power, if that makes sense. It's an active relationship, this learning of words. You have to listen. But we have those skills too. We just have to believe that we do. We think that it all happened 2,000 years ago and then it was lost. No, we start now.
Gadzooks, it feels to me like if we inquire into those words or words of power, as you say, Rachel, I mean, that's what our languages are now composed of. They were all born, as we were saying, in interplay with a speaking world. And so the very terms that make up our spoken languages are filled, we're all once magic. I mean, except for some exceedingly abstract words that are born in laboratories today, or born just in relation to computer screens. But so much of our language, it's a matter of taking any word and feeling into it, dropping into it, listening to it with an ear for puns, as well as feeling into its rich etymology. But sometimes an ear for puns is even better than those etymological dictionaries. But also listening to the sound spell, the texture, the taste of the word on your tongue. A word I've just glommed onto recently is hooligan. Hooligan, just because it sounds, it's very pleasurable to say, but so are so many other words. Asparagus, diaphanous, heron. All of these are words of power when they're used powerfully. So it feels to me, and using them powerfully is just as you're saying, Sharon, is using them to bind yourself to the wider world, using them to reach out and touch or tickle tickle the feet of that heron, or to pull the hair on a hooligan who's chasing me. So it seems to me, yes, if there's intention involved, the intention, just as Sharon is saying, is the intention to make contact with the other, with the otherness of the other, which I think you're calling its essence. Just the exquisite strangeness of this blade of grass that William Blake speaks about. Yeah.
We had a great question came up 5 minutes ago about animals then, and words, the sounds that they make. Are they using their sounds to transform the world in the way that we are talking about here?
Gosh, who knows? Yeah, that's really interesting. Again, in our traditions, you know, the shape-shifting phenomenon where people in our cosmology, goddesses particularly, slipped from animal or bird form back to human and so on again. And there was literally there's no sense of it being a big transition. It just happened. Suggests to me that there wasn't any differentiation, that people didn't see it as any different. You know, we have all those wonderful stories where of the oldest animals, the oldest animal motif, and particularly in Wales, you know, where people, so they can't solve a problem, so they go to the oldest people in the village, and when the oldest people in the village don't know, they say go to the animals, and eventually they end up at the oldest animals, the eagle of Rhonabwy, or who, you know, the salmon of whatever it might be, and they know the answers. But so there is I think there was a deep respect for animal wisdom, just as a different way of perceiving the world that probably translated into language as well. I don't know, Dave, whether you have any better insight into that.
Well, were animals using their speech to transform the world? All I know is, you know, when I have the luck to encounter a black bear and it roars at me, or around here, just in the last couple of days where I live on the outskirts or just outside the town of Santa Fe, there, in our valley, people have been glimpsing a mountain lion. And last year I had several encounters with a mountain lion, and when it speaks, you know, or you don't know it's in the vicinity, and I mean, that transforms me hugely, and I'm a part of the world. I'm a part of its world, and you can be sure I'm not the only creature whose hair stands on end when it hears that sound. But also, as you spoke just now beautifully, bird language, it seems to me that the speech of birds lies deeply at the origin of all our different tongues and twitterings and the ways we humans speak, because we were so entranced by what birds were saying to one another. Also because it was so alluring, because the melodious quality of many of their voices was just so compelling. But I mean, obviously at dawn, this whole chorus erupting across the land from all of the branches and the fields, birds are calling the sun up out of the ground. And at dusk, or just before sunset, around here anyway, in this valley, this chorus erupts again, and you can hear the birds just sort of calling the sun, or easing the sun down into the western mountains. So I have no idea whether the sun would actually rise without birds singing it up out of the ground. I don't know. It'd be a really hard thing to show. You'd have to sort of wipe out all the birds, because if they exist, any bird that exists cannot resist calling that fiery orb up out of the eastern waters.
Wow, so it could be the other than humans that are keeping the world spinning. I love that image.
Thank heavens for that. If it's true, we need somebody out there helping us.
Yeah, I just an image just came up for me, Sharon, about your maidens of the wells. You know, the hearing the voice of the earth. You know, and thinking of actually all the creatures really are voices of the earth, as we are as well. I just wondered if you had anything to say about the maidens of the wells, and who are they? Isn't it time they came back? You know, and any thoughts on that?
Yeah, but as quickly as I can, you know, that was very much the voices of the wells were the voices of the other world translated into this world. And you have to remember that in the Celtic traditions, it wasn't only Celtic, the native traditions of the British Isles and Ireland, wherever they came from, the other world was entwined with this one. It wasn't a place, it wasn't transcendental, it wasn't some kind of like airy fairy place. It was another layer of reality that was exactly entangled with this earth. And it was a place of moral authority. It was the place where they knew how the balance and harmony worked to keep everything going. And so the wells were the places where the otherworldly, nourishing, you know, life-giving waters of the otherworld flowed up into. And the maidens who tended the wells were kind of the givers of that, the mediators of that, if you like, in the human world. And so when, in the story that I tell in If Women Are As Rooted, a king who did not understand the necessity of the contract between people and the land raped a well maiden, the voices of the wells were lost, which meant that the other world, that otherworldly, very land focused, there's no distinction, voices did not offer themselves anymore. And then we had to work very, very, very hard to find them. So to me, that whole business of listening to the earth, of listening for the voices of the wells, of respecting the voices of the wells is just a matter mostly, and it's particularly relevant, I think, for these times of just shutting up. You know, we go on and on and on. It's really interesting in these times. I've really tried to be very quiet over the past couple of months of lockdown. I seem to have lost my own voice because there are so many people out there telling us how we must be, you know, talking, telling, preaching, exhorting. And what really I wish people would do is just shut up, because this is a time where we have been shaken to the core, and go outside and listen to the birds and listen to the trees and sit by a well and listen for those voices, because we've forgotten how to hear. We're so obsessed and so enamored of our own voices and how cleverly we can use our, you know, overly clever language, that we've forgotten what language actually is, that language is an active relationship, that it goes both ways, and we're not listening anymore. So to me, the story of that loss of the voices of the wells is really an exhortation to shut up and start listening. And here we are, kind of like, you know, talking anyway on this webinar, but it is, you know, it's proportional. I think it is a question of just shutting up, going out there, focusing on a bird, focusing on the relationship, focusing on a tree, and just seeing what's happening.
Mm.
Do you have anything to add to that, David?
Well,
I guess the bigger question is, yeah, why is it important now? Words, listening, magic.
It's just so beautiful what was just spoken. Just listening to the voices of silence, or to the many-voiced silence, to all these other beings that don't speak in words, but speak, carry so much meaning in their tongues, in the speech of the wind in the willows, the hush of the wind through the grasses, but bird song, cricket rhythms, the splashing speech of waves on the strand. Any sound can be a voice filled with meaning. I love what Sharon just said. Maybe I'll link just in a very simple way to how she was saying that, how you were saying, Sharon, that the other world is deeply entwined with this one when one is walking in tradition, or walking close to the magic way. And so it seems to me, speaking also as somebody whose work, my profession was that of a magician for many years, a sleight of hand magician, and performing around New England and then throughout Canada and the United States, and then taking it, the craft of magic, overseas, practicing in rural parts of Indonesia, of Nepal, of Sri Lanka, looking to meet traditional magicians who practice their craft in those regions. But speaking then as a magician or as an apprentice magician, I think that sense that Sharon just brought forth, that the other world is not elsewhere, that it's deeply here. So that in a sense, what we've all been speaking about in this conversation is a sense of radical imminence, where the holy or the divine is not somewhere else, but is right here, hiding sometimes just under that stone, just within that clutch of leaves. But that this world is a world of worlds within worlds within worlds, inexhaustibly outrageous and strange and mysterious. And also that the invisible, which for so many folks I bump into today, the invisible is some entirely other dimension, because this is the visible world. And then the invisible world is something else or somewhere else, or you have to close your senses down and go inside to contact the invisible world. No, this world is filled with invisibility. And just as the word itself says, the invisible is in the visible, right here. So that, for instance, the air between me and you, or between me and a nearby tree, if it were not invisible, I wouldn't see anything else. If the air around us was not outrageously unseen, invisible, we wouldn't be able to see anything we do see. So the invisibility of the very medium that we're immersed in, that is up against us, in our mouths, up in our nostrils and circulating through us, is itself invisible. So it's not two different worlds. It's dropping into the uncanny mystery of this world.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, Rachel, that I would say in relation to that is this whole time, I think, brings home to me more than any other time that I've ever experienced the perniciousness of our focus on ourselves to the exclusion of all else, you know, so that we think everything is about us, and we're so enamored of our own language and our own clever turns of phrase and our own, you know, polemics in the newspapers and on the blogs and on the websites, and it's just it takes something like this sometimes to happen to make you realize how exhausting that is, and how with that constant flow of ideas and words and opinions, we just never ever get to listen, even when we're writing about that kind of thing. And I think the other thing, you know, everything about the modern world has constrained to lock us inside our own heads and make us human-centric, including psychology, you know, which is my background. That's been the worst of the culprits, I think, of making us think that it's all about us. But as well as going into the world out there and talking to a tree, you know, we've also done things like come to believe that our dreams, for example, are made up by us, that stories are made up by us, that they have no independent existence. Whereas I would say that the other way that we can be in relationship with the world is by actually thinking that some image that comes to us in dreams actually is coming from outside us. It's coming from the world. It's coming from that old concept of the anima mundi, the world soul. It's not a product of our head and us making stuff up. So I think there are many, many different ways in which we can just step outside of that human-centric or individual-focused, or whatever word you want to use, way that we approach the world, and see everything as an active relationship, and just question, you know, is this really about me? Is this coming from me? Where is this coming from? How can I be in conversation with it? How can I how can I interrogate it? I don't mean in a kind of, kind of army kind of way, but how can I explore it? How can I explore what this might mean, as if there was something other than me that wanted to be in relationship with me, just as I want to be in relationship with it? Because I do actually think that's what the world wants. I think the world wants to be in relationship with us, needs to be in relationship with us, just as we need to be in relationship with it, because that's what keeps it alive too.